Texans hire Matt Burke as the defensive coordinator, and Frank Ross, the special teams coordinator, I don't know if it was officially announced yet or not, but he's sticking around, which is good news for the Texans because he was one of the guys who was actually doing his job well over the last few years, and we applaud that. Matt Burke, not a whole lot known about this guy, and I know a lot of people are skeptical. I've got reason for you to be a little bit less skeptical, but just a brief rundown of where he's been. He played football at Dartmouth, was part of a very good championship squad back in 1996, a year in which another team in the Ivy League, Cornell University, went much less than league champion. I think we were 4-6. Whatever. He was coaching at Harvard when the Titans called, and Jim Schwartz asked, hey, you guys got any bright young guys there that I might want to keep around as a quality control guy? So he went and he worked with Jim Schwartz for the Titans, and he's been mostly linebackers coach, defensive coordinator with the Dolphins for 2 years. We'll get into that in a little bit. Defensive special assistant. He was a run game coordinator and defensive line coach, game management coach in 2021 for the New York Jets. That was interesting to me. I've got an interesting, potentially discouraging stat about that right there. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I think my overarching feeling about this hire is that this is a good hire for DeMeco Ryans to have as a either co-defensive coordinator to help DeMeco out, or maybe a guy to transition into that, but not necessarily the guy, if you know what I mean. So we'll start off with what Ian Rappaport had to say about it, and it was once dubbed the most interesting man in the NFL. Burke spends his offseason climbing Mount Kilimanjaro, hanging out in Rwanda with gorillas, or skydiving. Now he'll call Houston his home. I feel like that was a subtle dig somehow at Houston. I don't even know how it would be. But Tom Pelissero reported it.
He's well regarded within the league as one of the smartest guys that you're going to find in football. And there is a connection here. DeMeco Ryans, of course, played in Houston alongside J.J. Watt, who had Matt Burke as his defensive line coach.
Okay, so I think, is that what you're talking about, Cavity Creep, D-line coach for Texans when Miko played? Because I don't know exactly what you're talking about otherwise. That's not the case. The connection here really would be Robert Saleh, I think, because Robert Saleh had Matt Burke as his analytics dude or game management dude while he was with the Jets. I think that ultimately, this is a guy that coached J.J. Watt last year too, at defensive line in Arizona. I think he's done a good job with that. We'll hear about him talking about Javon Hargrave when they brought him to Philadelphia and why they did, to give you an idea for the kind of style or scheme that he's going to use alongside DeMeco. Arizona runs a 3-4, but Burke has worked in both. And I think that he probably, given the style of defensive line play that he talks about, I think that's probably what the Texans end up doing, what DeMeco did in San Francisco last year, which was a 4-3.
It's pretty.
So, okay, here's JJ. Just to give you a little flavor on the guy, and this has nothing to do with how good of a defensive coordinator he'll be or not, but this is J.J. Watt describing that video that he saw at the very end of the season where he got all emotional and teary. Matt Burke was involved with that. Little brief video on that.
How that video came about, and I am massively thankful and will forever be grateful for this video. My D-line coach, Matt Burke, when I said I was retiring, so we had 2 weeks to basically put it together, and he just got on the phone and called the first person he knew and spread the word like wildfire, and people started firing their videos back, and I'm so grateful to him because
So there you go. He can get a lot of people rounded up real quickly via Zoom and video recordings to do a nice tribute video. Other than that, I don't have a lot to say about him as an actual defensive coordinator. We'll get to what the Dolphins did, which wasn't great when he was a defensive coordinator in 2017 and 2018. There's reasonable or viable excuses for that, but again, I don't think that Matt Burke. I would be surprised if Matt Burke is completely running the show as a defensive coordinator. I think this is, I don't want to say a compromise, but maybe D'Amico realizes that he doesn't need to be the full-time defensive coordinator, but perhaps kind of like a Sean Payton offensively, or a really like any Shanahan or Gary Kubiak offensively. He wants to have a coordinator, but he also wants to be heavily involved in the defense, perhaps. This, just to get you a taste of the style of play that I think is what appealed to JJ most likely, why JJ had 12.5 sacks this year as he was able to stay healthy, is that, yeah, they ran a 3-4 in Arizona, but there was a lot of getting upfield aggressiveness. This is him when he was the defensive line coach for Philadelphia, talking about the acquisition of Javon Hargrave, who had been at that point in his career a guy who played more of a gap control scheme, not real aggressive upfield.
What we look for in our D-line in terms of an attack front and guys that can disrupt and get penetration. He had a lot of TFLs and pressures and sacks for a guy that wasn't being asked to play that way. And
yeah, so I think if you look at this real quick too, and again, you're not hiring him to be a defensive line coach, except maybe a little bit you are. These are JJ's stats from the last few seasons, and if you look at 2022. He had 12.5 sacks, 25 quarterback hits. A lot of this is just based on health, but compared to in 2020 when he played 16 games with the Texans, it was a pretty good year. So I think he's shown some evidence of being able to work with defensive linemen. If you looked at Miami didn't do well. I think that he faced a lot of criticism in 2017 and 2018 when he was the defensive coordinator. I went back and read through some Miami publications, some of the Pro Football Focus and other sites to just kind of try to dissect things. There were a lot of injuries and excuses made on behalf of Matt Burke. I don't want to do that right now. I think if you look at Kiko Alonso, Miami linebackers missed a slew of tackles over the years. Kiko Alonso over the year. Raekwon McMillan missed 11 and 13 tackles respectively. They had poor tackling grades. Alonso also struggled in coverage. So that was a big part of what went wrong there. There's an ironic... Oh, and by the way, yeah, Laramie Tunsil, as I was rummaging through Miami media, I noticed that Laramie Tunsil had a really good year in 2018, which would come into play for the Houston Texans eventually. I think that one of the ironic things about him struggling as a defensive coordinator in Miami was that Richard Smith, one of the worst offensive or defensive coordinators or special teams coordinators in Texans history, he would become the defensive coordinator for Gary Kubiak the first 2 years he was here. Richard Smith actually had a pretty good run as Miami Dolphins defensive coordinator, but it was when he had a defensive-minded head coach in Nick Saban. And I think that might end up being, again, that's the nexus of why I thought, okay, D'Amico as the head coach with a heavy hand on the defense, but with a guy who's very well respected for his football intelligence in Matt Burke, and somebody that can help him carry the load there. I'm okay with that. I feel like, okay, if we get D'Amico's magic touch on defense and we get Matt Burke coming along and maybe getting a better version of him, especially if you got D'Amico, molding these young linebackers, that could mean something. We're going to get to Kingsbury in a minute. And as Maverick Best OP says, D'Amico would also run a 4-2 with an edge rusher too. Expect to see that also. Yeah. Generally that's nickel, and that's what teams do. That's why the distinction between a 3-4 and a 4-3 is not nearly as big as it used to be. So you don't try to get too caught up in it, especially like a Wade Phillips style 3-4 is way different than a lot of other 3-4s. So yeah, most teams these days spend a whole lot of time in either in a 4-2 nickel alignment or a dime alignment. And I don't worry about that as much. I think just when they line up in base, though, it'll probably be a 4-3, and Christian Harris will be a guy that you hope develops into a Fred Warner type. That's easy to say, and we just we hope that Jalen Petrie ends up a Tyrann Mathieu type, and we hope that whichever defensive lineman they rush turns into a Nick Bosa type. And it's just as simple as that. Hufanga is the safety for the 49ers, who I think it's very realistic to expect Jalen Petrie to turn into a Hufanga type, which is a Troy Polamalu type. Hufanga idolized Troy Polamalu, and I think there's a certain recklessness and a football intelligence that all three of those guys share. Obviously, you don't want to compare anybody to Polamalu until they actually start doing that type of stuff on the field. But this would be the one thing, I guess, that gives me a little bit of pause, because they laud Matt Burke as this super intelligent guy. I hate to lean on, hey, he went to Dartmouth, because there's lots of idiots at Dartmouth, okay? Especially when you start getting into the football team. But he's going to be a bright guy, and he's regarded as such. If you look at his year with the Jets, this is the aggressiveness index, and Texans Cap, good follow on Twitter at Texans Cap, sent me this our way. So this is basically how aggressive are teams in certain situations, especially on fourth down, how often they go for it. And usually analytically minded people these days are more aggressive on fourth down or in general. Robert Saleh in 2021, when he had Matt Burke as his what did we call him? His game strategy, whatever it was, it's game management coach. As his game management coach, not so hot. 20th. That makes me a little bit nervous. Not super nervous. Again, I think it's going to be a D'Amico Ryans joint, mostly. Okay, so we'll get to Cliff Kingsbury in a second. Tom Pelissaro. The super smart part is good. I think D'Amico Ryans having a co-defensive coordinator would be good. Let's see. Joe Blue says, I think Miko goes Shanahan approach. Shanahan is hands-on on offense. Miko will do the same defensively. I agree, and I hope so, without putting too much on his plate. The only thing that matters is Matt Burke play primarily zone. Will Stingley be used properly? Okay, that gets interesting, because if you look at Robert Saleh and the Jets, if you just look at the charts and look at, okay, how often do they play zone versus how often do they play man, it's more complicated than that. The Jets play a lot of zone, but, depending when you're in cover 3 or in other situations, or when you're playing blended coverages, you can play a lot of, man or quasi-man coverage, and that's what they do a lot up there with Sauce Gardner. I think that's why that's why Sauce Gardner was allowed to have the year that he had. So I would expect D'Amico to use Derek Stingley just as aggressively as Sauce Gardner is used with Robert Saleh. A lot of the same roots and philosophies there. And it's also interesting, though, too. This is one of the things that really excited me about D'Amico, because I think there's this tendency for people to think, well, they've got Nick Bosa, they've got Fred Warner, they've got all these studs. Like, not really. Yes, they've got Nick Bosa. Fred Warner was a third-round pick who was coached by D'Amico Ryans into being the Fred Warner that he is, and give all that credit to Fred Warner, but it's not like everybody saw him as some ethereal stud right off the bat. And if you look at the defensive backfield for the last 2 years for the 49ers, they had real issues 2 years ago playing man coverage. And D'Amico did a hell of a job. They had to play a lot of zone, but they did a hell of a job making up for it and really turning the defense around. And then this past year, they got a lot out of Charvarius Ward, who was not, a huge name free agent or anything. And the Lenore, the other guy, was kind of picked on throughout the year. And yet, even having a cornerback that got picked on, they ended up having a really good defense. And sure, Nick Bosa helps, Fred Warner helps, all those guys help, but it wasn't like that was just a superstar studded and stacked defense. And Hufanga, who we mentioned earlier, I think, was a big part of that too. And Hufanga wasn't a highly sought after draft pick or a highly drafted guy. So that part I feel good about. CBU says, I'm not here for the random Dartmouth shade. So for those of you just joining us, Matt Burke went to Dartmouth, which is a team that I played against 4 years in college. In 1996, my senior year, Dartmouth won the championship. I think Matt Burke would have been a junior that year. But then he went on to, he's been a lot of places. The Titans, the Lions, the Bengals, the Dolphins. The Dolphins is a defensive coordinator. The Eagles is a special assistant. The Jets is a game management coach. The Arizona Cardinals was just this past year. JJ had a great year. JJ has said nice things about him. That's different, obviously, being a defensive coordinator. The Cliff Kingsbury conundrum. Okay. I've got handwritten notes for Cliff Kingsbury. As all of you know, with my organizational skills, that doesn't always work out that well. First, Tom Pelissero.
Kingsbury, who spent some years here in Arizona as the Cardinals head coach, is interviewing today for the Texans offensive coordinator job. Kingsbury is due a lot of money from the Cardinals over the next number of years here, but also highly regarded as an offensive mind. He has a great affinity for DeMeco Ryans. There's a lot of mutual respect there. So this is a fascinating potential fit if Kingsbury wants to coach in 2023.
Okay. There's that damn if Kingsbury wants to coach. All right, remember Josh McCown? Like, hey, he still doesn't want to coach. Texans almost hired him as a head coach, but we're still not even sure he even wants to coach. As far as Cliff Kingsbury, my gut honestly tells me, okay, this is a courtesy interview. This is an interview maybe to have a nice discussion with Cliff Kingsbury about what it's like coaching Kyler Murray as a shorter, athletic, he's way more of a runner than Bryce Young, but he's got size disadvantages. He's thicker than Bryce Young, but he's got a height disadvantage. Maybe something like that. I understand and appreciate that Cliff Kingsbury was a hell of an offensive coordinator in college. I also understand and appreciate that his offenses in the NFL really he hasn't yet proven himself a really impressive offensive coordinator. He had, if you look at like offensive efficiency, he was middle of the pack or worse every year. He did have, this is my other fancy graphic, 2019, they were 21st in scoring, 2020, 6th, 2021, they were 8th, and then 2022, back to 21st. He had some excuses this year. But the 6th and 8th scoring offense is, that's nothing to sneeze at. That's impressive enough. I do think that a lot of it, though, especially as defenses started to figure out exactly what they're doing with Kyler Murray, it was overly simplistic by NFL standards. And yes, you can be an awesome air raid offensive coordinator in college, and that's a special skill to have. But it's just not the same when you get to the NFL. And when guys have predetermined reads, when you look on and you see, like, honestly, when I would watch the Cardinals, it looked like some of the guys who weren't the named routes on plays were just, the receivers were just slacking because they knew the ball wasn't going to come their way. The big question is always going to be, okay, was that because Cliff Kingsbury couldn't advance his scheme, or was it because Kyler Murray was holding him back? And unfortunately, I guess we won't find that out. I would point out too that Cliff Kingsbury, I guess you could say this, he managed to get Pat Mahomes drafted, was Mahomes 10th? Whatever he was, 10th, as opposed to number 1 overall. Like the Pat Mahomes' level of football knowledge coming out was not on the same level as Deshaun Watson. He had to learn a lot between college and the NFL. So I'm not impressed by Cliff Kingsbury as a football mind. John McClain said he thought that DeMeco should have at least one ex-head coach on the staff. I agree with that. I think he should have at least 1 or 2 ex-head coaches. I just don't look at Cliff Kingsbury as the ex-NFL coach to be the mentor for DeMeco Ryans. Cliff Kingsbury, if you're looking for a head coach mentor, Cliff Kingsbury has had 1 winning season in his last 7 seasons as a coach, as a head coach. In 10 seasons in which he's been a head coach, he's had 3 total winning seasons. 2 of those were in his first few years, and then he's had 1 in the last 7 seasons. So, he's not the guy. If you want to bring in somebody like a Gary Kubiak or somebody like that, and I know it might be a little bit awkward with Gary, but I don't know. Gary has a way of making things not awkward. He's just like a genuinely decent human being. I say Joe Gibbs, who I never played for, but I've heard so many stories from him. And Gary Kubiak, guys like this, sometimes you don't want to, you can't believe they're real at first because they seem so genuine. So I don't think there would be any awkwardness with Gary Kubiak being on staff just as a consultant. He probably wouldn't want to be called an assistant head coach again, just because of whatever weirdness that might ensue because of that. Robert says, I actually really am against the Cliff hiring, mostly because I'm firmly in the anti-Bryce and anti-Stroud camp. And that would be a pretty big indication that that's the direction we would go. That's a good point. Okay, if you're against Bryce Young and you're against C.J. Stroud, Bryce Young, I'm not anti-Bryce Young. I'm pro-Bryce Young, but terrified of him. I'm like, you know what I am? I'm the retired NFL player who's not sure if I want my son to play football because of just unknown potential health hazards, which that's not me, by the way. I don't have a son, and this non-existent son that I don't have isn't signed up for football. So I've never had to make that decision, but I feel a little bit like that. I feel like, hey, I love the kid. I think he's got everything that it takes, but I just worry that he's going to fold up like paper mache when he gets landed on the first time, even though it's illegal to even breathe on these guys much anymore. When I watched the Titans game where they played, instead of Malik Willis, they played the other kid whose name I'm blanking on right now, who's really pretty skinny. He's like 6'3", 215, but it's a skinny 6'3", 215, and he was 6'3", 190 coming out of high school. And I remember seeing, damn it, what is that kid's name? Somebody tell me in the comments. He's like a literal rocket scientist. He was in like rocket engineering in college. But I'm nervous about that. The one thing I wonder is DeMeco's coming from a place in San Francisco where they did such a good job building and coaching a team that they've been able to, I don't want to say burn or waste, but take chances on quarterbacks and spend draft capital and money on guys like Trey Lance and Jimmy Garoppolo. And maybe they found their guy in Brock Purdy. But I wonder if they figure, you know what, with the rule changes, we just don't know. We just don't know what's going to happen with these smaller quarterbacks. So let's take a flyer on Bryce Young, and maybe we'll see. As far as desired offensive coordinator, I don't think that Cliff Kingsbury is or should be the guy. I think that perhaps as a offensive consultant, because remember what Tom Pelissero said there in that clip, he's still getting paid. You know, he got back from, I'm flattered that he came back from Thailand to come visit us. I don't know if this was, the guy just spent 3 weeks in Thailand as far as I know. I don't know where his mind is. He might need two weeks just to kind of wring himself out. I'm not sure. Let's see. Joe Blue again says, I hate when they do only one comparison, Kyler Murray, but never bring up Drew Brees. Okay, good point. I will bring up Drew Brees. I'm actually really glad you said that in a moment. Kyler Murray is, I think, being brought up right now just because of Cliff Kingsbury. As far as Drew Brees, I think Drew Brees, you got to remember, the complaint with Bryce Young is not about his height. I think enough quarterbacks have done it at this point. Russell Wilson for a pretty good spell until whatever happened to him. Drew Brees, obviously, multiple other guys that have done it at 6 foot or 6'1". The height isn't as much a concern, especially if you have the football IQ. And Bryce Young, very evidently, I think, has that football IQ. It really is the size. It's a matter of physics. And I know it doesn't seem like there's a huge difference between 195 and 215, but there really is. Like, honestly, pick up a 25-pound weight and like think about that. I used to think about that all the time when I was playing. Actually, when I was done playing, because I would, if you put a 25-pound plate in your arms and run into somebody, you got a lot more oomph. And if you can envision whatever the reciprocal of that is in taking the hit, the weight does matter. There were years in the NFL where there was one year where I decided to try to play at 285 because they had me playing defensive end some in a 4-3, and I wanted to be, I was lying to myself. But I played at 285, and I was actually really productive in camp, but I was just getting buffeted around all over the place, like a ship with no anchor. It really, I could feel the difference between just 285 and like 295, 300. So I think it does make a difference. It's just a big experiment at this point. So I think that's the issue. As far as the shorter stuff with Cliff Kingsbury, I mean, I think they might just want to talk to as many guys as possible. Maybe bring Cliff Kingsbury in as a consultant Tony Rodriguez says Bryce Young needs to hit the squat rack and get to powerlifting. I'm always hesitant at first when somebody suggests that because, there's like some of these old guys. Like when I met Too Tall Jones once, and I don't think Ed Too Tall Jones spent a day lifting weights in his entire life. Maybe he did, but I don't think they were lifting much back then. And my God, what a big human being. And a lot of those guys that you meet from the 70s before they even started lifting weights, they're just gigantic human beings. Those guys were 275, but without lifting weights ever in their life. A lot of them had to work on the ranch and everything growing up, so that helped. But I'm always hesitant and reluctant to think, okay, it's just a matter of putting on muscle, especially with quarterbacks and throwing athletes. Sometimes it can screw things up, but usually that's when they're already bulky to begin with. I think if you look at Drew Brees, he got thicker as he got older. I think Alex Smith is a smaller guy who got a lot thicker as he got older. So I agree with you there that there's something to be said for that. And he seems like the kid seems like he checks off all the boxes in terms of intangibles. People love him. We did have a bit of audio today from Greg Cassell, a guy who breaks down film. He's been with NFL Films forever. Awesome, really bright dude. And this is going to be a surprise to some of you, but this is a very good notch in his favor, I think. Bryce Young, apparently, according to Greg Cassell, just gushes about Bill O'Brien. Like, just loves everything that Bill O'Brien has taught him, just really appreciated the way he coached him, all these things. And that's honestly really good news because as far as Bill O'Brien goes, I think most of you who've listened to me for a while know that it's not like I think that Bill O'Brien is just flat out a bad coach or anything. I think he's got blind spots as a head coach. I think he's got blind spots as an offensive coordinator too. But as an offensive mind and for what he strives to do, I know a lot of quarterbacks credit him with making them smarter. Ryan Fitzpatrick says that O'Brien kind of vaulted him into that second portion of his career where he's really a better quarterback for those last years that he had after he left Houston than he was beforehand in a lot of ways. I think sometimes O'Brien, though, is just so in love with complexity that he forgets to just drive home the simple stuff. So I'm intrigued by perhaps what he was able to teach Bryce Young. And when you're teaching college kids, there's only so much you can do, and you know it. You only have so many hours in a day with them. Those guys got to go to class and everything. So you just can't do as much. And I wonder, how much he was able to really drive into Bryce Young that a lot of young college quarterbacks don't have yet. So that part is very intriguing to me. I will be perpetually nervous about his size. Bryce Young could come here and he could spend like 7 seasons healthy, and I'll still be the grumpy weirdo that's wringing his hands in the offseason about whether Bryce Young's not big enough or not. It's just my thing. Okay, so Daniel Mason says, do you think D'Amico will co-call the defensive plays, and is he picking the staff or getting input from Nick? Daniel, I opened up with this, and I really feel this with this defensive coordinator hire. I think that this is very much, if you look at, go ahead and look at Matt Burke's resume. He's a guy who's been a defensive coordinator for a couple of years in Miami. It wasn't an awesome couple of years in Miami. There were reasons, there were excuses to be had for that. But he's been mostly a defensive line and linebackers coach. He's been, a game management coach at one point, whatever the hell that really means. I don't know. It feels like a fancy way to say consultant. Or maybe he really was up in the booth, like, with the tendency charts and everything. Whatever it was, I think this feels very much like a hire in which Burke is going to be either a co-defensive coordinator, maybe without play calling duties at first, but D'Amico can have kind of his drill sergeant. What's the military people tell me? Not the drill sergeant, but the non-com. The guy that basically gets stuff done for the lieutenant. He can be that guy and run the show to a certain degree and conduct practices and everything. But I think it's going to be D'Amico's defense. I do like that so far they seem to be going outside of both D'Amico and Nick Casario's comfort zone. They've interviewed a lot of guys that don't have really clear-cut connections to these guys. With D'Amico, I think the clearest path to Matt Burke is through Robert Saleh that year that Matt Burke just spent in 2021 as the as the game management coach for Robert Saleh. So there might be some good word of mouth there. That was something that Chip Kelly did when he first went to Philadelphia, and DeMeco would have been there for that. So Chip Kelly, let's revisit Chip Kelly and what DeMeco might have learned from Chip Kelly, because this is really fascinating to me. And I was so happy that he kind of shook a lot of us into our senses, because I was so obsessed with the Kubshanistan side of DeMeco Ryans that I was kind of neglecting the fact that he is a guy that's very inquisitive and talks to offensive coaches a lot, had actually played for both Andy Reid and Chip Kelly. Chip Kelly came in, and one of the really smart things that I think he did, especially as a college coach coming to the NFL, was he hired a lot of guys that he had zero experience with. So it wasn't a buddy system. It wasn't nepotism. It was flat out like, okay, what do people say about this guy? What do I think he can bring to the table? Remember, DeMeco's talked about having a diverse coaching staff, not in terms of, just ethnicity or anything, but like actually like different experiences, different teaching styles, all those things. So what do these guys bring to the table? And, how can I maybe avoid some of my own blind spots by hiring all my buddies or guys that have scratched my back? It's another advantage to DeMeco only being in coaching for 6 years. Not a lot of guys out there that have scratched his back, that he has to scratch back. One of them, the big kahuna, is Kyle Shanahan. He needs no back scratching right now. Maybe if he gets fired a few years from now, there's your new offensive coordinator at that point, because the Texans will be coming off 1 or 2 Super Bowls, and they'll have to replace somebody with Kyle Shanahan. So I think that was something that perhaps DeMeco learned from Chip Kelly. One of those guys was Jeff Stoutland. So, Chip Kelly comes in, hires Jeff Stoutland, the offensive line coach. If you don't know who Jeff Stoutland is, look it up. It's a great story. His first year as an offensive line coach was actually my freshman year at Cornell. I was a defensive lineman. He was the offensive line coach. He didn't know what the hell he was doing. He was learning it all on the fly. He was a defensive coach turned offensive line coach. Now he's roundly regarded as one of the best offensive line coaches, maybe in NFL history. They just year after year. He's been there through multiple head coaches there in Philadelphia now. And that's kind of what you get. He knew Jeff Stoutland by word of mouth through Nick Saban, and he hired him there. So I think so far it doesn't feel, my very long answer to your very short question about who is conducting things here, whether it's Caserio or DeMeco Ryans, I think it's both. And that's another thing I'll say too, is that I think we got to break ourselves out of this thinking that we've had, mostly because it's been a soap opera at NRG for a while. This thinking where there's a guy who's conducting things, or there's somebody with final say. And I think there certainly are GM head coach relationships where it is like that. But one big misconception people had about Sean Payton, and he addressed this in his press conference, people had this perception of Sean Payton was, well, he's going to want to go somewhere where he has total control and where he has final say, and he's going to want to have control of the roster and all of that. I don't know, maybe that's the case, but one thing he pointed out in the press conference was that he and Mickey Loomis worked together for 15 years, and they never had a disagreement over who to draft, who to sign in free agency, anything. If you can equate it to, like, think about a family business, and I know I've used this analogy before, but good, well-run family businesses don't necessarily always have, if 2 brothers own a business, one guy doesn't contractually have final say. They figure it out, and sometimes they might not talk to each other for 2 weeks, but they figure it out. And, you set aside, what a jerk your big brother was to you growing up, and you figure it out. It's one of my, if I were an owner, I as much as possible, and I would love to just tie the fates of both the GM and the head coach together and just say, listen, guys, it's you two. Like, one of you goes, you're both gone. So deal with it. Like locking. My mom used to do. Okay. Hypocrisy alert coming up. My mom used to do that to my brother and I because, we'd fight and argue a lot. So she would lock us in the room. She'd say, I don't want to hear anything until you guys come out of here. And then like 3 hours later, when we'd come out and and the room was destroyed, and my brother would beat the crap out of me. Eventually, she ended up moving her bed out into the living room for like 2 years until we could move into a bigger house. So that doesn't always work out. If she could, legally, she would have fired us both. But it's frowned upon. She couldn't just leave it. You can't leave a kid at the fire station at the ages of 13 and 10. Very frowned upon. So that's what I would do. And I think that's, for the most part, that's where Caserio is right now anyway, isn't it? I don't think Caserio is going to get another shot if it doesn't work out with D'Amico. The city's going to explode if somebody if somebody does that. Okay, Joe Blue says I kind of want Slowick. Slowick is the receivers coach for San Francisco, passing game coordinator for San Francisco, and I feel like that's gonna be the thing. The fact that there really haven't been more interviews makes me wonder if there's just maybe some subtle negotiating going on over minor stuff between Slowick and the Texans. I've got lint or something there. Which would be cool with me. I think we were talking to Mark Schlereth this morning, and I'm glad I talked to him because I think sometimes, as fond as I am of Kubshanistan, the Kubiak-Shanahan pipeline, it's important to point out that there are different models of it. The Rams run a different version of it, where it's a lot of the themes are the same. You're going to get a lot of zone running with West Coast passing concepts, but added onto that some deep shots, and a lot of play action. It's a lot of the same stuff, just different versions of it. Slowick comes from the San Francisco version, where I think they're going to want, if they hired Slowick, I think they'd want a fullback. They can catch passes. They're going to want tight ends. Like, just go out and get yourself a George Kittle, right? All right, it's not so easy, but George Kittle was a 5th rounder. And then you want guys like Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, who are just big brutes who can, this is what you need to know when you watch the 49ers play. Nobody ever complains about them throwing short of the sticks, because when they throw short of the sticks, Samuel and Ayuk drag guys for first downs. So I don't know, the 49ers, they throw short of the sticks a lot on 3rd down, but it works because, for one, credit Kyle Shanahan and the other guys on that offense for spreading it out. So it's usually those guys have to beat one tackler because things are wide open a little bit more. But they do have to beat a tackler, but they got these big physical specimens. So, and Andre Johnson and Kevin, I'm so nervous about saying Kevin Walter, because now between D'Amico Ryans and Owen Daniels and Kevin Walter. Okay, no S on Walter. Robert Jones says, what are your thoughts on the Texans trading for Trey Lance? This is my theory about Kyle Shanahan. If Kyle Shanahan is quitting on a quarterback, you are not going to get more out of that quarterback than Kyle Shanahan got out of that quarterback. And I didn't see enough from Brock Purdy right now, and I don't think Kyle Shanahan saw enough from Brock Purdy to really believe and know for sure that he's the guy. Because, there were some of those games this year, the receivers would average 10 yards after the catch and running. Again, because Kyle Shanahan does such a good job of shifting the defense and getting guys open in space. They're not just open, they're open with room to run. And when they brought Christian McCaffrey in, I think a lot of people think that offense just clicked when all of a sudden Brock Purdy took over. They brought Christian McCaffrey in, and Garoppolo had a couple of weeks with McCaffrey where things really started to open up. So I don't think they should let go of Trey Lance if they believe in Trey Lance. And if Kyle Shanahan doesn't believe in Trey Lance, then I don't think you're going to get the most out of Trey Lance. So that's where I would be with that. I think Robert Jones asked, will I be a consultant? We saw you in the group photo at the press conference. That's a tough one because I cover the team. I've told some people, I said it on the radio, that if D'Amico doesn't work out, then I'm going to quit my radio job. And I don't say that lightly. I feel very, very confident that it's going to work out with D'Amico. I think the Texans are going to give him a long runway. I think they're going to give him all the support in the world. I think that Caserio is going to vibe and work well with D'Amico Ryans. But I also believe, I feel like it's my duty to do whatever the hell I can, whether it's through criticism, behind-the-scenes work, feeding information on offensive and defensive tendencies to guys on the team. I want my job fate to be intertwined with D'Amico's. I want so badly for him to succeed that I have to basically put I have to put my money where my mouth is, and so that's where I am with it. And I don't expect to have to collect on that promise. We should probably have some kind of I guess look, if they win a Super Bowl, it worked out. Okay. We'll define what worked out is along the way. If D'Amico wins a Super Bowl, but then 2 years later he gets fired and it's not his fault, of course, it's somebody else. But I'm released from my promise to quit my job. And I didn't say how long I'd quit it for either. We talked about the Dougie Fresh. We talked about the Cliff Kingsbury interview. I want to know from any of you, are any of you actually pro Kingsbury? Because frankly, I just don't think that he has demonstrated that he's got an elevated NFL caliber mind offensively. I think he's a hell of an offensive coordinator in college, but running the air raid, I can't stress to you enough that running the air raid in college is almost like coaching a different sport than calling it the NFL, an NFL offense. And the big question, and I wonder if this is what the Texans, okay, I'm going to write this down. Thank you, Dougie Fresh, because you sparked this in my mind. I wonder if the Texans, in talking to Cliff Kingsbury, really want to know, for the sake of finding out if they're interested in Cliff Kingsbury, how much is he going to blame Kyler Murray? Okay, Kyler Murray didn't want to watch film apparently, or at least they wanted to put it in his contract that he had to watch a certain amount of extra film per week. Was it 4 hours per week? Was that because Kyler Murray just flat out was spitting the bit and didn't want to do it? Or was it because, honestly, at Arizona, they didn't run like your classic NFL schedule. Those guys were out of the facility damn early. It was a pretty laid-back affair, and I don't know how much Cliff Kingsbury was really driving guys for it to be any more than that. So sometimes guys don't know what they don't know, and I don't know if Kyler Murray knows what he doesn't know, because I don't know if Cliff Kingsbury was, the correct and proper tutor for him. Jalen Hurts is short. That's right. I'm not that worried about the height factor is all. I'm more worried about the size factor. Okay. Robert Jones, I'm glad you asked this, because this was news earlier this morning. Frank Ross, the special teams coordinator, is staying put. The Texans actually have a special teams unit to be proud of. They've been top 5. I believe they were top 5 in efficiency last year. They were top 5 this year. The special teams unit is actually really good. I'll give Caserio some credit for that too. Frankly, I think sometimes that is a GM thing. Usually, I remember talking to Joe Marciano about this, who, unfortunately, I feel like Joe's gotten a bad rap because he had those last few years where they were bad special teams. Joe had years and years of really good special teams, including when he went up to Detroit. They ended up having some really good years in Detroit with him as a special teams coordinator. But I remember Marciano always felt like defensive-minded coaches, and then obviously special teams coordinators like a John Harbaugh or a Marv Levy. Those guys tended to have better – they ended up care about special teams, where a lot of offensive coaches just flat out don't care that much about special teams. So, but I think it also takes the GM. I think sometimes GMs just are kind of either slacking, or they're thinking about getting guys that, without caring at all about whether or not they are A, capable of playing special teams, and B, and this is where culture comes in, are they willing to play special teams? I feel like if you've got a team full of guys and your starters are all guys who were cool enough to want to play special teams at one point, who never thought they were too good for special teams, then I think you've got a good culture. I think it's as simple as that. It's like taking guys that, it's like if you're working a physical job, if you're digging out a basement or baling hay or anything like that, the guys that that don't mind sweating and don't mind being a little bit miserable, and those are the guys that you want with you if you have to do that job again. There's guys you can only stomach so many prima donnas on a football team, and sometimes, and even if they're prima donnas, you want them to be a certain version of prima donna, like a Steve Smith prima donna. Like Steve Smith is a prima donna in a lot of ways, because he wants the attention and he commands the attention, but he's going to do it by, he's the ballerina that's going to punch you in the face so you pay attention. Is the prima donna an opera singing thing or a ballet dancer thing? I think it might be If it's an opera, he's the opera singer that's going to punch you in the face. So as far as being the consultant, I know you guys had asked me that question. I guess I would. But I don't think I should, kids, you should never do this. But I don't want to accept money to be a consultant. I'll offer it up for free. But if you want me to sit in a room and like watch for tells, offensive tells or anything, then hell no. No, I'm not. Or well, for money. I'll have to do that for money. But that's a lot of work. I didn't know how to get Robert Jones off of there, so I'm just going to click at random. I think Houston's waiting on the Super Bowl to be over and hire Eagles passing game coordinator. Okay, so Shane Steichen is the... Okay, that's a good... You know what? Let's do this. Let's do this thing. I want to... Shane Steichen is the offensive coordinator. Johnson there is the quarterback's coach, and he was waiting to see if Brian Johnson, the quarterback's coach, was waiting to see if Steichen gets the job either with Indianapolis or with the Cardinals, at which point they think that Johnson would want to be the coordinator for the Eagles, because why mess with a good thing, not to mention the fact that he's been working with Jalen Hurts. And as everybody would tell you, Jalen Hurts just seems like the most solid dude on earth. We got into a discussion the other day about who's a better leader, Jalen Hurts or Patrick Mahomes. So I asked the military guys, or people, to text in or tweet in, like who would be a better leader, like an ROTC. And I suspect it would be Jalen Hurts. I don't know if I've ever had such unanimous results. People said Jalen Hurts by a mile. I think it's just easy to envision Jalen Hurts in like his ROTC fatigues, isn't it? So Steichen is the offensive coordinator. The passing game coordinator is Kevin Patullo, and I guess if it was anybody from Philadelphia at this point is going to have some shine on him, I'd be cool with it. Let's see. Mike Leach's ghost will take over Cliff's play calling. That's a R.I.P. Mike Leach. Mike Leach's coaching tree and legacy in the NFL. You know what I would say? I think that for people who object to taking C.J. Stroud because Ohio State quarterbacks don't work out, you could have made the same argument about taking an air raid quarterback with Pat Mahomes. And, you know, there were a lot of the red flags around Pat Mahomes was, my God, he's in this wide open offense. He just heaves the ball up whenever he damn well feels like it. Like, how do I know that this guy's actually going to play within structure and not take all these chances with the football? I wonder, okay, ask yourself this. It's a little thought experiment. It's not fair, really, because Andy Reid's just really good at what he does. But if Pat Mahomes were to go with Andy Reid for 4 years, or if Pat Mahomes were to go with Cliff Kingsbury for 4 years, I don't think there's a chance in hell that Pat Mahomes, if he had 4 years in the NFL with Cliff Kingsbury, would be nearly what he is right now. And part of that was just with the design and the structure of those plays too, and how they operate. I mean, they do a lot of fun stuff out there at Arizona, but they don't operate with the same level of precision. And, you know, Pat Mahomes this year, that Buffalo game really did it for me. Man, that dude, he made that leap into, he is a complete and total in control, in command quarterback, like mentally, physically, all of that. And it started last year when teams started to show him cover 2 all the time. He had to really learn how to be conservative. He had to learn how to take, you know what he needed to learn? The intelligence is one thing, but then you have to learn judgment. And there are a lot of really smart people that still don't have judgment. I think there's a lot of really smart quarterbacks that don't have judgment. That's what plagued Ryan Fitzpatrick for a long time. He was super smart, but he lacked judgment. So this year especially, you could see Mahomes in that Buffalo game, once his ankle was injured, he just had to do it all with his brain. And everything they did to manipulate the defense and to call out, to figure out what was going on pre-snap, all of that is Andy Reid's influence on him, and then Pat Mahomes taking those lessons and learning it. He didn't learn that at Texas Tech. You know, he just didn't. So, but I don't know. I'm intrigued by Cliff Kingsbury potentially being on this staff. I just don't think it should be as offensive coordinator. Robert Jones says, as a offensive coordinator or position coach. Do you remember says, I love Cliff, he will be an ace. If not, he will get the axe. He's still getting paid a lot of money by the Cardinals. I wonder, I don't know if I feel like he needs a gap year. The gap year he never had. Like, that's a classic kid that should have spent a year hitchhiking across Europe, but he got a college scholarship and he went off and he did it. He never would have made it back from Europe, though, I suppose. No, he would have gone to like India or Pakistan, or he would have gone to like India or Tibet or something, and then he definitely would have never made it back. All right, Joe, I apologize, Mondragon. Your name's either Mondragon or Mondragon, like French for my dragon. I need you to recommend Steve Smith as wide receivers coach to Miko. He was a great receiver, very knowledgeable, has the right attitude to get these young wide receivers right. This is my first prerequisite for a coach in the NFL is that he has to have a burning need, a desire to coach, because this is why Romo never, ever, 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 ever would have worked out as a coach. He can't trouble himself to learn about the opponent he's about to do color commentary for. There's no way in hell he would have scouted and worked the way he had to be a position coach. I don't know if Steve Smith wants to coach. I think he'd be awesome at it. I think that he would. I think he might. Oh, boy, Steve Smith with rookies. He'd have so much wisdom to deliver, but he would get so frustrated. I wonder if Steve Smith might be a guy that realizes, like, man, I'd really like to coach and I'd really love to be that closely involved with the game, but I just can't deal with these rookies. I can't be the guy that's got to restrain myself from putting hands on a rookie. And, because, when you're a player and you get in a fight with somebody, it's a badge of honor, and usually guys don't sue each other over that stuff. I was on a team once where somebody got almost sued somebody for it. It was a mess. That was I don't think Kubiak didn't inherit that. That was before. Hi, DGMT6 from Monterey. That's sweet. Monterey, we had the kid in training camp from Monterey one year. Loved that kid. Mexican football player. Not Mexican-American. He was from Mexico. He's from Monterey. And the guys from Monterey come up to check out the team during training camp a lot. So I don't know if you're involved with that program at all. The actual football program there. It's semi-pro, I think. But anyway, they do quite a bit. Or they used to do quite a bit with the Texans. Oh shit, man! Come on, dude. All right, come on, man. All right, now I gotta. All right, block that user. I apologize to everybody. I hadn't seen that. I'll go back and. You ruined my whole vibe, man. I didn't even read the whole message. Don't anybody tell me what the whole message was. He had said something derogatory about Steve Smith in phrasing that he didn't need to say it in. In the words of Pat McAfee, allegedly, Cliff is the coolest guy ever, according to Pat McAfee. Bryce Young is a mini Pat Mahomes. I hope the Texans do whatever it takes to draft him. I think that Bryce Young versus C.J. Stroud is going to turn into a white-hot debate here over the next 2 months. I think that Texans fans will threaten each other, not physically. They'll despise each other, and yet at the end of the day, it'll be temporary. You have to all remember that, we got to keep this positive vibe going, because I haven't felt this way about the team in quite some time. And it was we were talking about this, Sean Pendergast and I were talking about this. We're right in this honeymoon phase right now where and this Matt Burke hiring might be where things start to tip. There weren't any decisions made yet. And in that moment, for this week or so, we've been able to say, everything's just going to be awesome with D'Amico, and I trust in D'Amico no matter what. And but I knew this would start to happen. They hired a defensive coordinator, and I see it. I see the fissures starting to form. People saying, like, boy, he was a defensive coordinator in Miami, and those Miami defenses weren't that good. I know. It's awesome, isn't it? Because it had to be this way. D'Amico and Nick Caserio are going to make some decisions you don't agree with, But it has to be that way, because if not, we would be criticizing them for never making the hard decision. We're going to find something to wring our hands about. Look at how much we worried about the center field position all damn baseball season long. And Chas McCormick ends up being a hero with his warning track angel up there in Philadelphia. It's this is what sports fandom is all about. So as far as the Matt Burke hire goes, for those of you who joined us as we moved along in this thing, Matt Burke, I think, is going to be as much a co-offensive coordinator or defensive coordinator, maybe the same way that Tim Kelly. Remember how Tim Kelly got elevated to offensive coordinator twice? In 2019, they elevated him to offensive coordinator, and people said, "Oh, good for you." And then in 2020, they said, "No, really, this year he's really the offensive coordinator. He's actually going to call plays this year." I think this might be that kind of a trial period for Matt Burke. He's been mostly a defensive line coach and a linebackers coach, as well as a little other one-off positions here and there. But I think he's a guy that shares the same philosophy on how to play defensive line. I think both D'Amico and Matt Burke like guys who are aggressive and get upfield. They took Javon Hargrave and kind of turned him into that guy. After Hargrave came from a defense where he wasn't doing that a lot, and up in Philadelphia, Matt Burke, when he was up there the first year that Hargrave was there, that's what he started being more and more of. So I don't know what that necessarily means for anybody on the line right now, because all those guys this year were running that similar style. You know, Lovey didn't really have those guys sitting there soaking up blocks, playing gap control. At times, I think they started transitioning into that more as the year went along out of necessity, because the run defense was just so unbelievably bad. But I think you'll see a 4-3 defense, which doesn't mean as much as it used to. Most of the time these days, teams are a nickel, which means you got 4 defensive linemen, a couple linebackers, a nickel back, and they'll get after it. They'll be super aggressive, and hopefully you'll get a bunch of guys like that. The guy from Monterey says that he's just a fan that lives there. Joe Blue says he would be happy with either. Cactus Yak says, what about getting Jimmy G? Draft another quarterback in the 3rd round. If anything, you go all out for Caleb Williams. We could get more draft picks or stud defensive players. All right, here's the thing, though. How does one go all out for Caleb Williams? I mean, you saw how hard it is to get the number 1 overall draft pick. You beat the Indianapolis Colts, and that's a thing. It takes just as much luck, either in the bad way or in a good way, if you want to be worst overall, to be the worst team in football as it does to go undefeated. You just can't gauge or time these things. So I just don't know. I don't know how that looks. I think right now what we've seen in the NFL recently is that there are multiple different ways to get a quarterback. I think statistically, your best option is still always going to be to draft a guy in the 1st round, the high 1st round. Statistically, that's your best option. But if you look at the field, so like in gambling, any one team usually is not favored versus the field. Like the Astros in any given year are the favored team to win the World Series, but they're not favored versus the field. You're doing really well if you got a 25% chance. If you're the favorite, usually you got like a 25% chance of winning when you start off the playoffs, and everybody else is the field. I'm going to show you something here. Let's just do this little experiment. This is why I like YouTube, because I probably wouldn't be able to do this without it being super boring on a radio show or a podcast. So Super Bowl quarterbacks from just moving backwards from 2021. Matt Stafford, traded for him. Joe Burrow, high draft pick. Pat Mahomes, high draft pick. Tom Brady, traded for him. Pat Mahomes, draft pick. Jimmy Garoppolo, traded for him. Jared Goff, high draft pick, eventually traded away, my God. Tom Brady, never heard of him. Nick Foles, not your named starter by any stretch of the imagination going into that season. Matt Ryan, number 1 overall draft pick, took a while. And then we get back into the more conventional era where it was a whole lot of number 1 overall draft picks, but still a Russell Wilson, a Colin Kaepernick, a Joe Flacco, Ben Roethlisberger, not a high pick. Aaron Rodgers, not a high pick. Drew Brees, first pick in the second round. And we can go on and on and on. Kurt Warner. So to think that you have to tank for a Caleb Williams, who, let's see exactly what the scouts think of Caleb Williams next year. It's just not so simple. It's not ever as easy as tanking for that guy. The other problem that I have with tanking, not just in the NFL, because I think with the Rockets right now, even though Rockets had the tank thrust upon them because James Harden and Russell Westbrook just decided to just get the hell out of town, they had a tank thrust upon them. But in doing the tanking, I think they've done pretty well drafting. The problem is, man, it's hard to build a culture when you're just getting destroyed routinely like that. And I have a hard time justifying potentially destroying a culture of young guys that just want to learn how to win. And that's been Nick Casario's strategy here over these last couple of years. It was to sign all these free agents to 1 and 2 year deals, these Christian Kirksey types, to hopefully bring in the right kind of guys that can show your Christian Harrises and those younger draft picks how to play football in the NFL, how to take care of your body, how to be a professional, basically, as cliche as that sounds, how to be a professional. So I don't think you should undo all of that. I thought that Marcus Spears said something really good on Inside the NFL the other day. It was nice to hear from somebody that, I know he's from the region, but he's not, a Texans fan or anything, but he's watched enough Texans game this year. He said, look, those guys are dogs. They fought Kansas City down to the wire. They fought the Cowboys down to the wire. They won a game that nobody or a lot of people didn't want them to win versus the Colts at the end of the year. They had a lot of guys that just fought their butts off. And I think you credit Lovie Smith with that, for part of that. But I think also the one thing I felt about the draft class this year was that I felt like they did a good job getting some guys that have some dog in them. And that's football character. That's let's look at the Texans draft history. I think that in the past, the Texans, in caring about character, they've been worried about the wrong kind of character. Like, they've been worried about, okay, is this guy an Eagle Scout? Does this guy hold the door for old ladies and all that? And certainly, of course, you want those kinds of guys. But you also, here we go. You also want guys that just got dog in them, So the first round, we'll see. I think Stingley's got some dog in him if he's allowed to actually, test it. If they test his dog, that dog will bite. I think Kenyon Green, his good plays were very mauling, physical, brute type of plays. The problem was he's just not. He's got to stay healthy. I think the injuries caught up to him, and I think part of it is that he's just he needs some man strength on him. He needs a good, genuine offseason rating. But Jalen Petrie, dog. John Mechie, all reports out of Alabama, a hard place to play football under Nick Saban are that he's a dog. Christian Harris, dog. Damian Pierce, oh my God, he just won a scepter for being a dog. Let me pause that down there. Thomas Booker, I'm not so sure about. The other guys, I mean, Austin Deculus, based on his college play, I'd say so. Davis Mills is Davis Mills. Nico Collins, Brevin Jordan. This is the question, because that was Casario's first class. I'm not so sure about the dog factor in Nico Collins, Brevin Jordan. I think Garrett Wallow is. I don't know what happened to him, but I feel like that's the way he plays. He's got some dog in him. So we'll see eventually how it plays out for Garrett Wallow, here, there, anywhere. Roy Lopez, dog. So the dog factor is good. In the later round draft picks, you can't worry about as much. So I approve of that, and I don't want to destroy that by, intentionally tanking for a year. There we go. So Caleb Williams, James Harden. I don't think this is the actual James Harden. Says, I like Caleb Williams when I'm not sold on tanking for him just to get a guy who might not translate coming in and might have character concerns. I don't know about Caleb Williams' character concerns. I'm fascinated now, though. I didn't know that. Or are you just thinking, let's see, who might not translate coming in, Caleb Williams' character concerns. Let's just look it up right now. It's that kind of evening. Amazing story about Caleb Williams. Something that speaks to his character. Was he dismissed for crying after games? I'm fascinated by this now. Brian, okay, exactly. This is what I'm saying. Byron Lee says, does this guy take the work equipment home during a pandemic? Yeah. Or some of those like conspicuous displays of hardodom, like out of Nick Martin, where like, all right, great, he does that, but like he doesn't play like or look like a guy that needed extra weight equipment at home during the pandemic, or that at least was using it. And it's like, in no offense, I think Nick Martin's a good dude and everything. It's just that's the kind of stuff that I always worried that O'Brien was overly impressed by, because remember the the offensive tackle that came from the Raiders. No, it came from the Jets. Bruno Giacomini. Like, I feel like O'Brien was in love with Giacomini, because Giacomini, like, after he got beat clean by a defensive end, he'd punch the defensive end in the kidneys as the defensive end made his way to the quarterback. Or like he'd jump on a pile. And O'Brien would talk about like, man, that's the kind of toughness you need. Like, no, that's not the toughness. No, the toughness you need are guys who kick ass on a football field. Like, it's as simple as that. We don't have to get any more complicated about this thing than you want guys who go out there and kick ass. Mark Bruner. I played with Mark Bruner. And honestly, before I ever met Mark Bruner, I didn't know anything about him. All I knew was he was a tight end that played for the Steelers. I was a young player for the Jaguars, playing defensive end at the time at times. So I scouted Mark Bruner a lot, played against him, and he was a badass. Like, I would have assumed that Mark Bruner spent his offseason like getting in fights with merchant marines down on the docks or something. Like he was a badass. I figured he had a flat top. I met Mark Bruner, and my God, he was like the nicest guy who ever lived, and he still to this day is. Like, super family man, just like a Ned Flanders in a lot of ways, like chiseled like Ned Flanders, but he would kill you and take your soul on a football field. So you just can't tell by that, like the extraneous stuff. Exactly. Like, Bruner was never going to jack somebody in the kidneys after a play or anything. He wasn't that kind of guy, but that's exactly the kind of guy that you wanted. Give me guys that kick ass. I don't care how good I don't care if they talk tough, before the combine, like the Trevor Penning kid. Trevor Penning's out there beating up on Division II guys and all this stuff that he just flat out doesn't have to do. But some coaches fall for it. I wish somebody would ask Sean Payton about that. Oh, we had Schlereth on today, and he does consulting work with the Saints, or he did with Payton. I should have asked him about Trevor Penning. Let's see. LOL, I'll take Caleb greater than Will Levis. GMs will fall in love with, though, 100%. Yeah, the Will Levis having all the measurables things, it's a terrifying thing. I got to get going because my wife, I can smell, she's making bacon for dinner. And I'm just like a dog in one of those old commercials. We're having an early dinner of bacon, and then I think we're going to watch Tulsa King or something like that. Send me some more questions on Twitter. Oh, follow me on Twitter at Seth C. Payne. Oh, you know what I ask of you? Follow the YouTube channel, but also follow me on Instagram, because I got the directive today that I need to start hitting the gram more often, which I just can't, because you guys know how much I love taking selfies. So look for more Instagram info out of me. Look for at Seth C. Payne on Instagram, at Seth C. Payne on Twitter. Follow and like here and recommend to somebody. Look, honestly, if it doesn't work out with D'Amico 3 years from now, YouTube might be my full-time job. So you're contributing to the Seth Payne's Kids College Fund and the Seth Payne Feed His Own Big Belly Fund if you subscribe to the YouTube channel. And I appreciate everybody. I think your comments are awesome. I forgot to answer your question, Joe Blue, about my thoughts on Cray, the chief of staff. I'm going to be honest with you, Joe. I'm going to do a deep dive on Cray this weekend. Maybe I'll do a video on him because I've never heard of a chief of staff before on a football team. I don't like the political connotations, frankly, but I do like that the video everybody sees of him is of him with the boombox going out with the team. I feel like that might be the right kind of dog stuff. So thanks, everybody. And I very much appreciate the comments, except for the guy that I had to ban. And I apologize that I did not see that when I put it up on the screen. Bad juju. So thanks, guys. I'll do the bobblehead until it